All right, looks like we are live. Well, thanks everyone who's joined us on Facebook or YouTube to watch. My name's Arno Rosenfeld. I'm a reporter with The Forward. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I'm here with Omar Shakir from Human Rights Watch to discuss a new Human Rights Watch report that many of you may have seen earlier this week that accuses Israel of the crimes of apartheid and persecution. So I'll just start by way of a little introduction for you, Omar, and then if I miss anything, feel free to weigh in. So you're the Israel and Palestine director at Human Rights Watch, where you investigate human rights abuses in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. You were previously a Bertha Fellow at the Center for Constitutional Rights with a focus on U.S. counterterrorism policies, and have also investigated human rights violations in Egypt for Human Rights Watch. You were previously a Fulbright Scholar in Syria. And Omar holds a JD from Stanford Law School, an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown, and a BA in International Relations from Stanford. So also spent a lot of time in the Bay Area. I'm from San Francisco. And you are now based in Amman, Jordan. Did that cover it? Is there anything else to add?
You got it, yeah.
Great. So we're here to talk about the new report, which is called A Threshold Crossed. It's a lengthy 213-page report, but kind of the top line message is that Israel or Israeli authorities are guilty of committing the crimes of apartheid and persecution, which are sort of defined terms under international law against Palestinians. And you know, I wanted to kind of start by talking about the broader context here, because a big part of the response from sort of people critical of the response has been not to engage with necessarily the substance of it, which I do want to dive into, but it's been focused on Human Rights Watch and, you know, you yourself. So critics allege that Human Rights Watch is biased against Israel, that it focuses too much on Israel, and that, you know, you yourself are an anti-Israel activist, and so we should just ignore, you know, the actual stuff in the report. The Israeli government seized on this concept that you were, you know, biased against Israel in expelling you from the country in 2019 for supposedly supporting the BDS movement, a claim which you and Human Rights Watch have said is untrue. So I was wondering if we could kind of start by addressing this idea. You know, is Human Rights Watch biased against Israel? Are you biased against Israel?
First of all, thanks, Arno, for hosting me and for this thoughtful conversation. So, look, I mean, the Israeli government is following its playbook here. Its patented tactic when it gets criticism of its human rights record is not to engage on the substance, but to shoot the messenger. This isn't unique to Human Rights Watch. We've seen the same tactic used with Israeli groups, with Palestinian organizations. As you know, Arno, Human Rights Watch works in 100 countries across the world documenting human rights abuse. I would say that in probably half those countries, when we release a report that's hard-hitting, the criticism is that we're biased. But the fact is, we work in every country in the Middle East and North Africa. I personally have documented human rights abuse. My first big report at Human Rights Watch, the first one on Israel-Palestine, where I found crimes against humanity, was about PA and Hamas arbitrary arrests and torture, where we called for the ICC to look into these crimes, to cut security assistance. Of course, in 2014, my first major report for Human Rights Watch was on the mass killings of protesters by Egyptian security forces, where again, we found likely crimes against humanity. So the reality here is we're following the exact same methodology that we follow everywhere else in the world. We document the facts, we apply the law. As you said in your introduction, apartheid and persecution, we're not using this in a historic or comparative way. We're applying the law. Apartheid, the prohibition against apartheid is customary international law. It's a crime against humanity also set out in the Rome Statute to the ICC. That was in 1998, after apartheid ended in South Africa. So these are legal terms, and our report aims to assess facts against these legal standards.
Right. And then, you know, BDS is sort of a trigger for a lot of people when they hear it. So, you know, was it true Israeli authorities made this claim in revoking your visa that, you know, you were promoting or supporting BDS? You know, is that accurate? And does this new report support the BDS movement or call for a boycott of Israel?
Neither Human Rights Watch nor I, as its representative, have called for boycotts of Israel. We don't take a position for or against the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. This report doesn't change that at all. Our recommendations in this report stem from ending complicity in crimes. That's what we do when we find serious abuses. We tell rights bearers to avoid complicity there, right? Our recommendations are not to consumers, are not to everyday people. They are to governments, to businesses, because they have human rights responsibilities. And our recommendations to them are to end activities that make you complicit in rights abuse, not to boycott, particular countries, areas, much less, a people. And so I think, look, at the bottom, at the end of the day, when I was deported, it's important to note that case went up to the Israeli Supreme Court. And what the Israeli Supreme Court found was that Human Rights Watch's work documenting abuses by businesses in settlements and our call for companies not to be complicit in those abuses was a call for a boycott. This is, bread and butter human rights work we do everywhere. Just as we tell a company that produces garments not to abuse the rights of workers. The idea is respect human rights, respect the law. And that call was interpreted by the Israeli Supreme Court to be a call for a boycott. And the reality here is, if that position is a call for a boycott, that's a mainstream position even within Israel. The idea that settlements, are not part of Israel and that you should avoid settlements, right? And we had amicus in my case that include the former head of Israel's foreign ministry, who said in a submission to the court, my views are that of Omar and Human Rights Watch. So if he's being deported, deport me along with him.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction to make, because outside of Israeli law and even Human Rights Watch, that distinction between boycotting settlement goods is something that a lot of, there are Zionist Jews in the United States that support that call, who would never support a broader boycott of Israel. But all right, I just kind of wanted to address that because I think a lot of, of our readers are curious about that. But I also want to get into the report. So I wrote an article about this earlier this week, which I believe is available in the chat on Facebook for anybody who wants to take a look after we're done speaking. But that goes into some of the details. It's a lot of stuff, though. But fundamentally, the news is that it says Israel is guilty of the crimes of apartheid and persecution, which are crimes against humanity under international law. So I was wondering if you could give a quick overview of what each of those crimes are. What is apartheid outside of just the South African context? What is persecution, which is, of course, we use in vernacular, but what does it mean? And how did you reach the finding that Israel has, committed those crimes, and where have they committed them, against whom?
Absolutely. So apartheid is defined as a crime against humanity. It's set out in its own convention, plus the 1998 Rome Statute to the ICC. It involves three things when they come together. In essence, you need an intent by one group to dominate another. Secondly, you need systematic repression by the dominant group over the marginalized group. And third, you need particularly grave abuses known as inhumane acts. The convention uses the term racial group, but human rights law defines racial group to include distinctions based on ethnicity, national origin, a number of other characteristics. Persecution has a very similar definition. It's discriminatory intent when it leads to severe abuses of fundamental rights. So Arno, what we did with this report is we spent 2 years evaluating Israel's treatment of Palestinians across Israel and the occupied territory. We connected the dots between Human Rights Watch work that spans 3 decades. Plus, we did new research on case studies for this report. And then, as we always do, we applied the law on discrimination, including these laws around apartheid and persecution, which is both, again, a criminal offense, but also incorporated as in customary international law for apartheid, as a prohibition. When we did so, we reached the unfortunate conclusion that Israeli officials are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. We base this finding on a overarching government policy between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, so across Israel and the occupied territory, to maintain the domination of or by Jewish Israelis of Palestinians, combined with particularly severe abuses committed against Palestinians in the occupied territory.
Right. And so, when you identified those two crimes, are those taking place in both Israel within the 1948 borders and in the occupied Palestinian territory, or does it only rise to the level of those crimes in the West Bank and Gaza?
It's a good question, Arno. So what we say in this report is there's one government that in effect primarily rules over the area across Israel and the OPT. So between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, its officials are the ones committing apartheid. And that's really important to note, because I think there is this idea in parts of the world that somehow there's sort of different systems that are in place. At the same time, we're very, and apartheid, by the way, is a crime about domination of one group over the other, right? In this case, Jewish Israelis over Palestinians. So what we found in the report is that the elements that I just laid out of the crime come together in the occupied Palestinian territory, but pursuant to a single Israeli government policy. That policy is to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians. And in the occupied territory, that policy or that intent is coupled with inhumane acts and severe oppression committed against Palestinians living there. So we're very clear that some of the abuses that rise to the threshold of apartheid we found in the occupied territory. But at the same time, we're talking about a single government pursuing a single intent and a single policy with different degrees of intensity of the repression against Palestinians in different areas.
Got it. And do the does that sort of repression or the human rights abuses that you found against, I guess, non-Jews within Israel proper, within the 1948 borders, do those rise to the level of crimes under international law, just not the crimes of apartheid and persecution, or do those not rise to the level of crimes in that region?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's no question that Palestinian citizens of Israel have more rights than Palestinians in the occupied territory. That's a major difference between the status of Palestinians in one place or the other. But even in Israel, Palestinians face discrimination, including in where they can live, including in the quality of schools they attend. Human Rights Watch wrote a report 2 decades ago about separate and unequal school systems for Palestinian citizens. There are hundreds of small Jewish Israeli towns across Israel that have by law the power to effectively prohibit Palestinians from living there. At the same time, the crimes of apartheid and persecution require a high threshold of repression, which Human Rights Watch found in the occupied territory. So there is discrimination against Palestinian citizens of Israel. That discrimination reflects the intent to dominate. However, Human Rights Watch's apartheid and persecution determination was made based on the intent to dominate and based on the severe repression that takes place in the occupied territory. We aren't saying the crime takes place in every part of the territory. Rather, we're making a determination that the crime takes place where the inhumane acts and systemic, when the inhumane acts and systemic oppression is combined with that intent to dominate.
And one other thing that has come up among people who are sort of skeptical of these claims is the question of Gaza and this idea that, how can Gaza be occupied if Israel left it? It was, a painful process at the time when that happened, I guess 15 or so years ago. Certainly they control 3 sides of the Gaza border, the border into Israel and the maritime border, but Egypt controls the other border. And, I understand Israel provides some, there's some integration there. But they do not administer the law in Gaza. They aren't going in and out of Gaza. So why is Gaza considered, occupied by Israel for the purposes of this report? And how can they be dominating or controlling the lives of the residents of Gaza if they are not in the territory there?
A very fair question. So it starts out with, again, apartheid's a crime about domination, right? So while Israel withdrew its settler population and ground forces in 2005, it retains overarching control over Gaza. What do I mean by that? It controls the movement of people and goods. Let's put Egypt aside. I'll come to it in a minute. Controls the movement of people and goods, right, into and out of Gaza. It's enforced for 14 years a generalized ban on travel outside of humanitarian exceptions. It controls the airspace. It controls access to sea. It blocked the building of an airport and a seaport. It controls the population registry. So it registers every Palestinian, born in Gaza. It controls who can have a Palestinian ID card. And if a Palestinian wants to even go from Gaza to Ramallah, which under international law is a single territory, right? That's one entity. And Israel recognized Gaza as part of entry to the West Bank. So you should be able to move between Gaza and Ramallah the same way you move between New York and Washington, D.C., right? But Israel, even if you leave via Egypt through Jordan and come to the West Bank, Israel still controls your ultimate entry into this territory. Of course, and there are many other collection, control of the no-go zone between Gaza and Israel, and I could go on and on and on. On Egypt, Egypt has been, as Human Rights Watch has documented, complicit in many of the restrictions on Gaza, but its obligations differ. The UN, the ICRC, the International Committee for the Red Cross, many governments consider Israel to be the occupying power in Gaza. Egypt is another country without that similar duty of an occupying power. So while it has been complicit in the closure, ultimately Israel has a different level of responsibility. So your question was, how does Gaza fit into the apartheid framework if there are no Jewish Israelis living there? Well, Gaza, according to Israel and the world, is part of its single territorial entity. It's a part of the occupied Palestinian territory. So when you compare the treatment of people in Gaza with Jewish Israeli settlers living in the West Bank, all the disparities we talk about are there. And ultimately, and this is uncomfortable for some people to hear, but I think it's important, and we document it in the report, that ultimately Israel has pursued a separation policy between Gaza and the West Bank. When you look at how Israel has enforced that separation policy since 2005, it's basically, when we look at the data, we look at statements by officials, they've effectively blocked Gaza residents from living in the West Bank for demographic reasons. What do I mean by that? It's allowed Israel to consolidate a Jewish majority in Israel and over the West Bank, which they intend in full or in part to retain in perpetuity. So in essence, it's gerrymandering a Jewish majority. You're taking 2 million Palestinians who live in a 25 by 7 mile open air prison off the demographic books in order to consolidate a Jewish majority elsewhere. And this isn't just conjuncture. This is actually what we see in statements by officials and the data that we looked at, as well as in the policy and practices on the ground for 14 years.
Yeah, and I want to return to that because that's something that I also talked to other folks from Human Rights Watch about for the article. The differences between the way Gazan residents and Palestinians in the West Bank are treated. But before we get there, I do want to ask, why is this report coming now? So I understand it was 2 years of research, but part of the response we've seen from Palestinian activists and leaders has been that, as far back as the early 2000s, they've been analyzing the legal regime that controls Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza as sort of a single entity, and making the claim that it amounts to apartheid, that, there's unequal treatment across the board, that's apartheid. Going back to the 60s, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, has been referring to Israel as an apartheid state. So this is not a new concept. And a lot of the things that you point to in the report, as you say, cover 3 decades of, human rights abuses that you've documented. And so, why in 2021 did you choose to kind of make this assessment?
Many people have talked about apartheid, have done so, not all, have done so in a comparative, historic way, sort of, or a hypothetical or a future way to say there are practices like South Africa, right? That's not Human Rights Watch's point of reference, right? Human Rights Watch makes determinations based on the law. And apartheid is a crime against humanity. Crime against humanity are among the most odious crimes in international law. We don't reach these determinations lightly. So while many of the abuses do go back many years, there was long a debate about whether Israeli authorities had an intent to dominate Palestinians. Why do I say that, right? I say that because in the 90s and in the 2000s, there was hope and a sense among many that maybe there would be a political resolution, to this situation that would lead to an end to the systematic repression that takes place. Israeli government officials would publicly say, Arno, in court and otherwise, this is temporary. That's how they justified settlements in the Supreme Court. That's why the Supreme Court put its stamp on settlements being, for the most part, legal, right? But what's changed in the last 4 or 5 years? A few key things. One, Israeli officials now openly proclaim their intent to rule over the West Bank in perpetuity and treat Palestinians there as subjects. Secondly, we have seen the massive expansion of settlements and infrastructure connecting settlements with Israel proper. Third, we saw the passage of the Jewish nation state law, which entrenched, codified as a constitutional value, right? The idea that one group of people on the ground has rights that are denied to the others. So when we put all those things together, it just became impossible not to see a clear intent to dominate. And let me just conclude by saying, as I noted, I wrote the report about crimes against humanity in Egypt. There we said with the killings, there we said probably crimes against humanity because the evidence of government planning was present, but wasn't as voluminous as we have here. Here, there's no such qualifier. The reams and reams and reams of evidence made it clear this was our determination. We know we're not the first. We will not be the last. But this was a matter of us reaching the determination that we felt fit the facts. We didn't set out to write a legal brief. We set out to research a topic, and which was Israel's treatment of Palestinians, taking the research we had done in the Negev, in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, in Gaza, trying to tie it together, doing new case studies and applying the law. And that led us to this determination.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Jewish nation state law, which was obviously very controversial at the time, including among folks in the United States. But part of the pushback against that was like, look, this is just it's been a Jewish state. That's nothing new. And that's been one of the criticisms of this report as well, is that it misses the context. There are a lot of pieces of the report, but talking about what's going on in Israel proper and this sort of preferential treatment of Jewish Israelis, the law of return, the nation state law. And people say, look, that misses the context. Yes, it's not perfect. It's not the United States, but this was a state that was, forged in the aftermath of the Holocaust. It comes after millennia of persecution against Jews. It's meant to be a Jewish state. It's meant to be a haven for Jews. And while, it wants to ensure equal treatment of non-Jews, at least in the sort of practical sense, at the end of the day, it's a Jewish state. And that is kind of reframed, critics might say, in the Human Rights Watch report as this intent to dominate. I think B'Tselem, which was an Israeli human rights group that reached the same conclusion, calls Jewish supremacy. And I think a lot of people recoil at that because they're saying, look, this is a haven for Jews. It's meant to be a haven for Jews. And apparently, Human Rights Watch can't accept that. So I guess I want to ask, aside from the specific, there is the military administration and the inhumane acts that are occurring in the West Bank and Gaza, but is the premise of a Jewish state and saying we want this state to be for Jews, is that inherently, contra to human rights, or is there a way to have a affirmatively Jewish state for Jews in Israel and around the world without violating the human rights of its non-Jewish residents?
It's a really good question. International human rights law gives states a wide variety of latitude when it comes to immigration, when it comes to things like language use and identity. There's nothing in international law to bar Israel from prioritizing Jewish immigration. And it is a fact that many Jewish Israelis came to Israel or came to mandatory Palestine before that to flee anti-Semitic persecution in other parts of the world. However, that prerogative is not a license to systematically discriminate against and repress another people already living on the ground. So so the point here is not to say in principle that you can't, prioritize Jewish immigration. You can't try to preserve a Jewish identity, preserve the Hebrew language, religious, cultural institutions. But when you go about doing policies, and I'll give you examples of that in a minute, that are discriminating against the people that are already living there, that's where we have a problem, right? So, examples of that would, for example, be the 2003 law, right, that Israel passed that effectively bars the granting of legal status to Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip married to Israeli citizens or residents. Israeli citizens or residents can marry people from virtually any other country in the world and grant them legal status to live with them in Israel, but denies that right to Palestinians, right? There is no legitimate security justification for that policy. It's a demographic argument. So, and there are other examples. There is no legal justification, for example, for having land policies, right? Like in hundreds of small Jewish towns that have the power by law. Again, this is a law that doesn't discriminate on its face, but it empowers communities to effectively exclude people from living there based on who they are. That's impermissible. I could go down the list of examples. So the idea is not in principle the preservation of any identity. The idea is when you pursue policies pursuant to that intent that violate rights.
Got it. And I think the other critique about the context that perhaps Human Rights Watch was missing, or perhaps you considered and was incorporated into the report, but it's this question over terrorism, and a lot of what the occupation looks like in the West Bank, certainly what it looks like in Gaza, came after the Second Intifada. When Israelis living in Israel, civilians were subject to suicide bombing and sort of a campaign of terror attacks that I think traumatized many Israelis and reframed the conversation around security within Israel. And so I think a lot of Israelis, a lot of Jewish Americans point to terrorism as the reason for a lot of these restrictions as the reason for the security barrier, for restrictions on freedom of movement, et cetera. And people say, look, you didn't even mention terrorism in the report. I know you did mention national security or security concerns. And I'm curious if you can talk about, are there sort of restrictions on human rights that are permissible in order to prevent terrorism or, national security threats, such as restrictions on freedom of movement? And are there things that Israel is doing that bear no relation to you mentioned demographic concerns? Are there things that you found in inhumane acts that do not have to do with genuine security concerns by Israel?
Yeah, let's take the 5 inhumane acts, the 5 clusters of inhumane acts we focused on. Let's answer your question sort of against those, right? So we found 5. I would say 3 of them do not have any security justification or use security as pretext to advance demographic goals. So let me explain those quickly, right? So one is the mass confiscation of Palestinian land in the West Bank, more than 500,000 acres of land. Those have no security justification, right? That's land, 99% of that allocated by the Israeli government goes to Jewish Israeli settlers. There's no security justification for land grabs. Another policy we talked about is the coercive policies in the majority of the West Bank under Israeli rule in East Jerusalem that make it impossible for a Palestinian to get a building permit, in effect, while settlements can massively expand. And, between 2016 and 2018, we have statistics in the report from the government that shows Israel issued 100 times more demolition orders for Palestinians than building permits. That is those demolitions happen for lacking a building permit that Palestinians can't get. There's no security justification for that. The third category of inhumane act that we talked about was stripping 500,000 Palestinians of their legal status in the occupied territory because they weren't in the country in 1967 when Israel occupied, or they were abroad for too long between 1967 and 1994, or since 2000 Israel's effectively frozen the population registry, which is the kind of database for getting switching your address or getting family reunification. That uses security as mere pretext to advance demographic goals. The other 2 inhumane acts have a security justification, but Israel's pursuit of those goals go beyond what international law offers. The first of those is the movement restrictions. So, of course, Israel faces legitimate security challenges from Gaza, but what Israel's policy is to ban the travel of all people in Gaza, absent narrow humanitarian circumstances. They don't conduct individualized security assessments. Nobody would fault Israel for saying, hey, I don't want to let this person into Israel proper, because, they pose a security threat. But Israel's barring travel from Gaza to the West Bank or abroad based on a generalized ban. You can only travel if you fit within a humanitarian exemption. That goes beyond what human rights offers. And the last inhumane act is the mass suspension of civil rights for 4.7 million Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. That includes the right to free expression, assembly, association, or any say over the government that rules over them. Again, there is a security justification. Israel could say, well, if I let anybody associate, if I let all protests happen, that'll mean rocks and being thrown at settlers, etc. Right? But the military law that Israel imposes is so draconian that Palestinians can get 10 years in prison for protesting without a permit peacefully. Right? And I could go on and on and on. So let me conclude by saying in those examples where security is a consideration, Israel has pursued a strategy of domination, right? So in an intent to, like a security motivation does not negate an intent to dominate when you pursue a strategy of security through domination. So I guess just as, if you said, for example, hey, I got security concerns, I'm going to torture this detainee, or I have security concerns, therefore I'm going to indiscriminately bomb an area. That would not justify, it doesn't justify apartheid and persecution.
Great. I think that's a helpful explanation. I wanted to sort of go a little bit deeper on something that you brought up at the beginning, coming to the last few questions. So if anybody in the chat does have their own questions, please let us know before we wrap up. But one thing that I found really interesting was that distinction between Gaza and the West Bank. And, I believe in other conversations that there's this idea, or a policy that if, a Palestinian in Gaza marries a Palestinian from the West Bank, they are allowed to settle in Gaza, but the Gazan resident is not allowed to settle in the West Bank, or that, sometimes the conditions under which Palestinian prisoners are released from Israeli prison is on the condition that they, relocate. They're from the West Bank, but they relocate into Gaza. And so can you talk about, are those examples accurate? Are there other examples? And what is that about? You mentioned a demographic sort of goal, but why is Israel treating Palestinians in Gaza different than Palestinians in the West Bank?
Yeah, and Arno, it's a very thoughtful question. It's something that, Gisha, the Israeli human rights group, has done some really important work on as well. Israel's policy, and it's written, you can find it on the website of the Israeli army, of Kogat, that to the extent that they allow, sorry for the sirens, it's 30 minutes to curfew in Jordan, but to the extent that they allow a movement between the West Bank and Gaza, family reunification, they allow it in Gaza, right? And if you look at the statements by Israeli officials, and if you look at the evidence we put forward in the report, it points to a simple explanation. It's because Israel wants to demographically ensure a larger Jewish majority across Israel and the West Bank, which they intend to rule over permanently, in part or in full, right? Whereas Gaza, for them, candidly, is sort of turned into a receptacle to hold a large number of Palestinians who don't count against the demographic ledger across the area Israel hopes to retain. In some ways, it is the more dramatic example of the same strategy Israel pursues with the enclaves, with the dozens of Palestinian enclaves around the West Bank, right? Area A versus B and C, for those that are familiar under Oslo, Israel controls Area C, the majority of the West Bank, much of the land. Where you have people, those tend to be the areas where Palestinian Authority manages some affairs. The idea is, and this is what we document as the intent of Israeli policies, maximum land, minimum Palestinians. And in fact, the Gaza withdrawal and policy since then is the most clear, in my mind, manifestation of that policy.
Great. And I think we do have one question from viewers, and I think, or from a viewer, and I think it's a good one to conclude on, though I may have a follow-up depending, but here you go. Benjamin has posted that. So what are you hoping comes next? What's the goal of the report? Where do you want it to go from here?
Yeah, look, for years, prominent voices have warned that apartheid lurked just around the corner. This study shows that apartheid is not some hypothetical future scenario. That threshold has been crossed. Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution today. You can't solve a problem if you don't accurately diagnose it. So the first step is really recognizing the reality for what it is. Apartheid is the reality for millions of Palestinians. We know apartheid won't end overnight. So our first step is to call on the world to have the courage to call the reality on the ground for what it is, and to take the steps that a situation of this gravity warrants. So when we find crimes against humanity anywhere else in the world, including when I wrote the report on Egypt, we call for investigations and prosecutions, which we call for, of those Israeli officials implicated in the crime. Secondly, we call for conditioning arms sales and military and security assistance to the Israeli government on steps to end apartheid and persecution. And we call for a wide set of other recommendations, all of which aim to ensure non-complicity by rights bearers in the crimes. And that all will only happen once we call a spade a spade. A 54-year occupation is not temporary. A 30-year peace process will not end systematic oppression. Millions of Palestinians denied their fundamental rights for who they are is not simply a matter of abusive occupation. We have systemic discrimination, and that needs to end.
Well, I think that's a good point to end our conversation on. Of course, there are endless numbers of questions and directions to go, but I think that gives a good sense of what was in the report and where Human Rights Watch is hoping things go from here. Again, the article that we wrote about this is in the chat, and you can access the Human Rights Watch report either on their website or through the article. Omar, do you want to plug the website URL? Is it just HRW?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know the exact URL, but if you go to Human Rights Watch, hrw.org, you'll probably find it there. Encourage everybody to read the report, and we welcome feedback, discussions like this. And I really thank the Forward and Arno for doing a really comprehensive job, giving different perspectives and coverage for this important report and its findings. Regardless of what you might think about the term, read the report and look at the facts and make your own determination.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you, Omar, for joining us, and for everybody who is watching on Facebook and YouTube.